Chapter 1. An Ordinary Day, an Ordinary Life. The morning sun barely made its way through the dense skyline of Manhattan, casting a soft golden hue over the bustling streets below. Sarah Matthews, a 30-year-old barista, stood behind the counter of the Roasted Bean, her small but cozy coffee shop located in the heart of the Lower East Side. The air inside the shop was filled with the rich aroma of freshly ground coffee, and the sounds of milk frothing and espresso shots being pulled provided the usual rhythm to her day. It was another Monday. Sarah's life had become a routine, almost too predictable. Wake up at 6 a.m., pour a cup of black coffee for herself while scrolling through the headlines on her phone, and then head out for another 8 hours of serving lattes and cappuccinos to the same crowd of tired professionals, college students, and tourists who came in for their morning fix. The days blended together, each one slipping into the next, and for the most part, Sarah had grown comfortable with this. It wasn't glamorous, but it was enough, or so she kept telling herself. She'd moved to New York City 5 years ago, after graduating from a small college in Vermont, hoping to make something more of herself. She dreamed of working in publishing, or at least something related to literature, perhaps even writing a book herself one day. But after a few years of sending resumes and attending interviews that never went anywhere, Sarah had come to terms with the fact that this city didn't care about her dreams. It didn't care about anyone's dreams, unless you were already at the top. Sarah's life, it seemed, was stuck in the middle, too far from the top to feel truly fulfilled, but too afraid of failure to do anything drastic. So she settled. The coffee shop, with its mismatched chairs, vintage posters, and warm lighting, had become her little corner of safety. She had a small group of regulars who chatted with her during their morning visits, and she liked that, liked the predictability, the lack of pressure. She liked that no one expected anything more from her. This particular Monday morning was no different. The clock on the wall ticked closer to 10 a.m., and the shop began to fill with the usual assortment of customers. A couple of college students sat at the table by the window, their heads buried in laptops as they typed furiously, probably working on assignments that would never be finished on time. A businessman in a tailored suit ordered his double espresso, barely acknowledging Sarah as he handed over a crisp $5 bill. Then there was the woman in her mid-40s, a regular who came in every morning to read the paper while sipping on her skim latte. Sarah had memorized her routine by now. "Good morning, Sarah," the woman said, giving her a brief smile before burying her face in the newspaper. "Morning, Mrs. Collins," Sarah replied, as she prepared the usual drink. Everything was as it should be, until the door swung open and a man walked in, his presence immediately standing out against the backdrop of the usual crowd. He was tall, probably in his late 30s, dressed in a sharp navy blue blazer that looked like it cost more than Sarah's entire wardrobe. His dark hair was neatly combed back, and his eyes, a piercing shade of blue, swept over the room with an almost calculating precision. Sarah felt a flutter in her chest for reasons she couldn't explain. He walked up to the counter, and she couldn't help but notice the way people seemed to take notice of him. The regulars glanced up briefly, some with curiosity, others with mild interest. The man didn't seem to notice them at all. He was too busy scanning the menu overhead, his expression unreadable. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked, trying to sound as casual as possible, even though she suddenly felt self-conscious. She wasn't used to this kind of attention, especially not from someone who looked like he belonged in one of the penthouses overlooking the East River. "I'll have a black coffee," he said with a deep, almost husky voice, his eyes now meeting hers. There was something about his gaze that made her stomach do an odd flip, but she couldn't place it. It wasn't romantic, no, it was more intense, as if he was sizing her up, figuring her out in a way she wasn't comfortable with. She nodded and began preparing his order, trying to shake off the strange feeling. She'd seen wealthy, polished customers come and go before, but this man, he was different. There was something unsettling about the way he held himself, a quiet confidence that bordered on arrogance. When she handed him his coffee, their fingers brushed briefly. It was a fleeting moment, but for some reason, it sent a shiver down her spine. "Thank you," he said, his lips curling into a polite smile. It wasn't much, but it felt significant in some way. He then turned, as if his business here was done, and began walking toward the seating area. As he sat down at a table in the far corner of the shop, Sarah found herself stealing glances in his direction. She quickly chastised herself. What was wrong with her? She had enough on her plate without getting distracted by a random customer. But something lingered, something she couldn't quite put into words. It was as if he had a story she needed to know, a story that might somehow intersect with hers. She pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the tasks at hand. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. An hour later, as the shop began to empty out and the lunch rush started to dwindle, Sarah was in the back room sorting through some invoices when she heard the doorbell chime. She turned, expecting to see a regular or perhaps another walk-in customer. But instead, it was him, the man from earlier. He was standing by the door, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for something. When their gazes locked, he gave her a nod and walked toward the counter. "Excuse me," he said, his tone suddenly serious. "I think we need to talk." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What?" she asked, caught off guard by his directness. "I'm sorry for the sudden approach," he continued, his voice low, almost too smooth. "But I believe you and I have something in common." Her brow furrowed. "I'm sorry, but I don't think we've met before." "We haven't," he said with a slight smile. "But I know you. Or at least I know something about you. And I think it's time you knew the truth." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had no idea what he was talking about, but something in his eyes told her that whatever it wasn't good. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "My name is Michael Reeves," he said. "And I'm about to change your life." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. This was no ordinary customer. This was no coincidence. Her life, the one she had so carefully built to be small and predictable, was about to be shaken in ways she couldn't even begin to imagine. The weight of his words hung in the air, and for the first time in years, Sarah wondered if this was the moment her life would truly begin. Chapter 2. The Stranger's Proposition. The words Michael Reeves had spoken echoed in Sarah's mind long after he left the coffee shop. I'm about to change your life. She had tried to shake the feeling that something was off, but it lingered, gnawing at her thoughts. Who was this man, and what did he know about her? More importantly, why had he singled her out in a place as mundane as the roasted bean? By the time Sarah closed the shop for the night, the weight of his visit still hung over her. She had told herself to let it go, to write it off as another odd encounter in a city full of them, but something told her that she couldn't. She tossed her apron onto the counter and grabbed her coat, the chill of the evening air hitting her as soon as she stepped outside. The city was still alive, the hum of late-night traffic filling the streets as the neon lights of bars and billboards flickered overhead. Sarah adjusted her scarf and started her walk home, lost in thought. The small apartment she had lived in since moving to the city was only a few blocks away. But tonight, the familiar walk felt unusually long. She reached her building and climbed the creaky stairs to the third floor. Her apartment was small, a modest one-bedroom with just enough space for her to feel somewhat comfortable, but not enough to ever forget that she was still scraping by. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. She kicked off her shoes and threw her coat over the back of a chair, heading straight for the kitchen. Opening the fridge, she stared at the empty shelves for a moment before grabbing a bottle of cheap white wine. As she poured herself a glass, her phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from Emily, her childhood friend back in Vermont. How's New York treating you? Found your dream job yet? Sarah rolled her eyes and quickly typed a response, her fingers moving automatically across the screen. Same old. Still slinging coffee and trying to make rent. She paused for a moment, then added. Maybe it's time to make a change. The words felt strange coming from her, but they held more truth than she was willing to admit. She tossed the phone aside and took a deep gulp of wine, her thoughts drifting back to Michael. What did he mean? How did he know anything about her life? The unsettling way he spoke, the quiet authority in his voice, it wasn't the kind of thing she could just forget. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of her alarm blaring at 6:30 a.m. She hadn't slept well, her mind too restless to allow for much rest. But it was another day, and she had no choice but to get up, put on her work uniform, and go through the motions again. The roasted bean was relatively quiet when she arrived. The usual crowd hadn't started trickling in yet, and she had a few minutes to herself before the rush began. She busied herself with prepping the coffee machines, wiping down counters, and making sure everything was in place. But even in the stillness of the shop, her thoughts kept returning to Michael. Around 9 a.m., just as Sarah was pouring a cup of coffee for a regular customer, the doorbell chimed again. This time, when she turned to see who had entered, her heart skipped a beat. Michael Reeves. He was standing in the doorway, his sharp blue eyes scanning the room as if he knew exactly where he was headed. He walked toward the counter with the same smooth, confident steps she had noticed the day before. When he reached her, he paused for a moment, as if considering something before speaking. "I thought about what I said yesterday," Michael began, his voice just low enough that only she could hear. "And I realized I didn't give you enough information. I wasn't trying to scare you, Sarah. But I think you need to know what's at stake." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. There was something in his tone, something both reassuring and deeply unsettling, that made it hard for her to speak. "I know this is unexpected, but you have to trust me when I say this. I've been watching you for a while now. You have a gift, Sarah, a talent, and I think you're wasting it here in this shop. You deserve more than this." Sarah blinked. "Watching me? What the hell are you talking about?" "I'm not a stalker, if that's what you're worried about," Michael said with a faint smile. "I know this sounds crazy, but I've been doing my research and I know your potential. I've seen what you're capable of." She stood frozen, the cup of coffee trembling slightly in her hand. "I don't. How do you know all this?" Michael leaned in a little closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "I know your family history. I know your mother's secrets. The ones she never told you about." Sarah's blood ran cold. What are you talking about?" He took a deep breath, his gaze intensifying. "Your mother was involved in something much bigger than you realize, Sarah. And so are you." She felt her knees go weak, but she steadied herself by gripping the edge of the counter. "Stop. I don't know what game you're playing, but I don't want anything to do with it." "I'm not playing a game," Michael said, his voice calm but insistent. "You're in danger, Sarah. And if you don't start asking the right questions, things are only going to get worse." For a long moment, Sarah said nothing. Her mind was racing, her pulse pounding in her ears. Was this some kind of sick joke? A con? Or was there some truth to what he was saying? She thought about her mother, her quiet, reserved mother who had passed away 2 years ago. She had always kept her life private, and there had been times Sarah wondered if there was more to her mother than she had ever known. But this was too much, too bizarre to be true. But Michael's gaze was unyielding, and the intensity in his eyes was hard to ignore. Something inside her stirred, a deep, instinctive sense that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't lying. "Why me?" she finally managed to ask. "Because you're the only one who can stop it," Michael replied, his expression darkening. "You're the key, and you're running out of time." Chapter 3: Unraveling the Past. The weight of Michael's words hung in the air long after he had left the roasted bean. Sarah stood behind the counter, her hands shaking slightly as she wiped the same spot on the counter over and over again, unable to focus. The morning rush had come and gone, but she was trapped in her own head, trying to process the strange conversation that had just occurred. "You're the key," the words replayed in her mind, each repetition sounding more and more absurd. Yet she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off about it all. She'd always known her mother was a private person, but to think she'd been involved in something bigger, something secret, Sarah wasn't sure if she was ready to believe that. She wasn't sure if she even wanted to. The bell over the door jingled again, signaling another customer. Sarah snapped back to reality, forcing a smile as she greeted the woman at the counter. But her mind kept drifting back to Michael and his cryptic warning. Her mother had always been such an enigma. She had never really shared much about her past. All Sarah knew was that her mom had been born and raised in upstate New York, had come to the city in her 20s, and had worked various jobs before settling into a quiet life as a librarian. But now, suddenly, Sarah was being told that there was some dark secret tied to her family history, a secret that seemed to involve her mother, and, by extension, her. After the lunch rush had quieted down, Sarah found herself staring at her phone, hesitating to pick it up. She had told herself not to contact Michael again, not to get caught up in whatever game he was playing. But the more she thought about it, the more she felt this tug to know the truth. She had always been the curious type, the one who would go digging when something didn't sit right, and this didn't sit right. She tapped out a quick message to Michael. Asterisk, where do I start? You said I needed to ask the right questions. Asterisk. She almost expected no response, thinking maybe Michael had said all he needed to say, or worse, that he had already moved on to someone else. But within minutes, her phone buzzed with his reply. Asterisk, meet me at 7 p.m. at the old library on 5th. Bring your mother's belongings. Asterisk. Sarah stared at the message, her breath catching in her throat. The old library. It was the building her mother had worked at before she passed away, the place she'd spent so many hours. Why would Michael want her to bring her mother's belongings? What did he think he was going to find? The thought made Sarah uneasy, but something told her she couldn't turn back now. She had to know. That evening, Sarah arrived at the library, her heart pounding as she stood outside the grand, darkened building. The structure was an old one, built in the early 1900s, with tall, arched windows and intricate stone carvings above the entrance. The area had once been the center of the neighborhood, but now, it stood in near silence, its role in the city slowly fading away as newer, more modern buildings rose around it. Inside, the library was just as she remembered it. Quiet, filled with the smell of old books, and bathed in the soft light from the street lamps outside. The air was thick with dust, as though the place had been forgotten by time. It was a far cry from the bustling coffee shop she worked at, but somehow it felt more familiar, more comforting. Sarah made her way to the back of the library, where she knew Michael would be waiting. As she entered the small office area, she found him standing by a desk, flipping through a stack of papers. His expression didn't change when he saw her, but he gestured for her to come closer. Did you bring them? He asked, his voice low and steady. Sarah nodded, pulling a small box from her bag. Inside were the items her mother had left behind, old letters, a few photographs, and some of her personal journals. She had never been able to bring herself to go through these things after her mother passed away. It felt wrong to disturb what little was left of her, but now, it seemed that those things might hold the key to understanding what was really going on. She set the box down on the desk, and Michael opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the contents as he picked up the first letter. He turned it over in his hands before sliding it aside and pulling out a small, worn photograph. Sarah leaned in to look, and her breath caught in her throat. The picture was of her mother, but she was standing next to a man Sarah had never seen before. He was tall, with dark hair and sharp features, and he wore a military uniform, an old one perhaps from the early 1980s. There was something about the way he stood next to her mother that unsettled Sarah. It wasn't just the stranger in the photo. It was the way her mother looked, her eyes filled with a quiet intensity, as if she were hiding something behind that smile. Michael's eyes lingered on the photo for a moment before he set it down. He glanced up at Sarah, his expression unreadable. Do you recognize him? He asked. Sarah shook her head. No, I've never seen him before. I don't even know who he is. Michael's lips tightened. That's exactly the point. He stood up and walked over to one of the bookshelves, pulling a thick, dusty tome from the top shelf. He flipped through it quickly, his fingers skimming the pages with practiced ease before he stopped and pointed to a page in the middle. Sarah leaned over, trying to make sense of the words on the yellowed paper. What is this? She asked. It's a record, Michael replied, from an organization your mother was involved in. It's not something she would have told you about, but it's the truth. She was part of something much bigger, something secret. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she looked at the cryptic entries. There were dates, locations, and codes that made no sense to her, but one name stood out to her like a beacon. Alexander Cross. Michael's gaze softened slightly as he saw her recognition. He's the man in the photo, and he was your mother's partner, but not in the way you think. They were both part of an intelligence operation, one that was involved in some very sensitive matters. And your mother, she was protecting you from it. Why didn't she ever tell me? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. She was beginning to feel like she had uncovered something she wasn't ready to understand, something that might shatter everything she thought she knew about her mother. Michael's face hardened again. Because she didn't want you involved. But you're in danger now, Sarah. The organization is still active. And you, whether you like it or not, are part of it. Chapter 4. The Burden of Truth. Sarah's mind raced as Michael spoke. His words were like a jigsaw puzzle she wasn't sure how to solve, each piece revealing more of a dangerous picture than she was ready to confront. She stared at the photograph of the man her mother had clearly known, Alexander Cross. His name haunted her thoughts, but more than that, it was the realization that her mother had been involved in something so secretive, so far removed from the life Sarah had known, that made her feel like everything she believed about her past was a lie. Michael's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. You need to understand, Sarah. This isn't just about your mother anymore. This is about you. You're a part of something bigger, whether you accept it or not. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Sarah didn't know how to respond. She had only come here to understand her mother's life, maybe to find some closure after her passing. But this was a nightmare. I don't understand, she whispered, still staring at the photo. How could she keep something like this from me? How could she not tell me about this, man? Michael's gaze softened, but only slightly. Your mother had her reasons, and they weren't because she didn't trust you. She loved you, Sarah. But she wanted to protect you from a world she knew was dangerous. She could feel the tension in the room, heavy, suffocating. She wanted to ask more, but she wasn't sure if she could handle the answers. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. Is there more? She asked, her voice unsteady. Michael nodded slowly, picking up another letter from the box. It was old, its edges curled, and the handwriting on the envelope looked familiar. It was her mother's handwriting. He handed it to Sarah without a word. With trembling hands, Sarah opened the envelope and pulled out the letter. She began reading, her eyes scanning the familiar words, but they didn't make sense at first. It was a letter from her mother to someone, asterisk to Alexander asterisk, she realized. And in it, her mother had written of secrets, of things buried so deep that Sarah didn't think she could understand them. Asterisk, I've made my choice. You've given me no other option. I can't go back now. The agency is watching, but I will keep my promise to you. I'll protect Sarah no matter what. They'll never know, Alexander. They can never know. Asterisk. Her hands went cold as she read the words over again. It felt like the ground beneath her had shifted, like her reality was crumbling, and she was falling into a deep, dark abyss she didn't know how to escape from. What is this? She asked in a daze, her eyes meeting Michael's. What do you mean, the agency? My mother was protecting me from... What? Michael took a deep breath, stepping back from the desk. He appeared to be carefully considering how to phrase his next words, as if he didn't want to overwhelm her, though he surely knew there was no going back now. Your mother's agency was a covert intelligence operation. It wasn't just a simple job. It was a deep cover assignment, one she took on to protect you from forces that could destroy your life. The world she was part of was dangerous. Even now, it's dangerous. They were involved in operations that spanned continents, working with governments, corporations, and organizations far beyond anything you could imagine. Sarah's head spun. She felt the words hitting her like waves, crashing over her, drowning her in confusion. You're saying she was involved in espionage? She asked, though it sounded absurd even as she said it. Michael's eyes were hard now, as if he had expected the disbelief. Not just espionage. It's far more complicated than that. Your mother was a key player in some very sensitive operations, but her role was always about keeping you safe. She was part of a larger network, one that your father and later you were unknowingly connected to. Wait, Sarah interrupted, her pulse quickening. My father? I never knew anything about him. My mom always said he died in a car accident when I was little. That was a lie. Michael didn't flinch at her outburst. Your father was part of the same network. He died in that accident, but it wasn't a random event. It was orchestrated by the agency to protect him and you. Your father was involved in something far too dangerous for someone like you to understand at the time. They were the ones who arranged it to keep him, and ultimately you, safe. Sarah's throat closed as the implications hit her. Her entire life was a lie, a carefully constructed facade built to keep her out of harm's way. She thought of her childhood, of the love her mother had given her, the warmth of their home, the sense of normalcy she had always cherished. Was it all just a lie? Was her mother's love the only thing that had been real? You're telling me my entire life has been a cover-up? Sarah's voice cracked. Michael's face softened, his expression almost sympathetic. I'm not saying your life hasn't been real, Sarah. I'm saying that your mother was trying to keep you safe from a world you weren't ready for. From a world that still sees you as a target. She felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. The idea that she wasn't just an ordinary woman trying to get by in New York City. No, that was a delusion. She had always been a part of something much larger, much darker. And she had no choice but to confront it now. Michael moved closer, leaning in slightly as if to emphasize the urgency of his words. There's more, Sarah. I need you to understand this. Your mother's mission isn't over. And it's not over for you. I've seen things. I've uncovered pieces of the puzzle. And I'm trying to help you put it all together. She felt a knot form in her stomach. What do you mean? What pieces? Michael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he grabbed another folder from the desk, the file marked with a red stamp. Top secret. He slid it across the desk to Sarah. She hesitated but opened it, her eyes scanning the documents inside. There were photos, dates, and locations, connections Sarah could barely make sense of. And then, at the bottom of the last page, something that made her blood run cold. Sarah Reeves, daughter of Eleanor Reeves, is the key to completing Operation Phoenix. She dropped the file as if it burned her, the room spinning around her. The words echoed in her mind, repeating in a relentless loop. The key. Operation Phoenix. Michael, what is this? She gasped. Michael's eyes were filled with an emotion she couldn't place. Something between regret and urgency. It's a black operation, Sarah. A covert mission that involves more than just intelligence. It involves people's lives, and it involves you. You've been targeted, and you don't even know why. But the sooner you accept it, the sooner we can stop it. Her world had just shattered into pieces. And now, it seemed that the only way to rebuild it was to follow a man she barely knew into a world full of shadows, lies, and danger. But one question continued to haunt her. Was she strong enough to face whatever came next? Chapter 5. Into the Darkness. The weight of Michael's words still pressed down on Sarah as she sat there in the dimly lit library office, surrounded by files and photographs that had once belonged to her mother. The words, "You've been targeted," echoed in her mind, over and over, like a hammer striking the same spot. Operation Phoenix. She had no idea what that meant, but she had a sinking feeling that it wasn't good. Nothing about this seemed good. She glanced at Michael, his face shadowed in the low light, as he stood by the desk, arms folded across his chest, watching her. He had been giving her space to process the truth, but Sarah was beginning to realize that there was no space left. The truth had come crashing down like a wrecking ball, and now, there was no way to rebuild her old life. What does it mean? Operation Phoenix? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael didn't flinch at her question. He seemed to expect it, like he had been waiting for her to ask. He walked over to a nearby filing cabinet and pulled out another folder, this one thicker than the others. The red stamp on the front said, "Top secret," just like the file she'd seen earlier. He placed it in front of her with a soft thud. Operation Phoenix was an initiative created decades ago. Michael began, sitting down across from her. It was part of a covert intelligence operation run by a clandestine organization that operated both domestically and internationally. The goal was to identify key individuals who could serve as assets, people who had the potential to change the course of events. Your mother was one of them. Me? Sarah's voice trembled. What does that even mean? What kind of assets are we talking about here? Michael's eyes were steady, but there was a flicker of something behind them. Something dark. Not all assets are agents or spies, Sarah. Some are simply targets, people with certain skills, or people who are simply connected to those who have the power to change things. You were never meant to be involved in this. But the organization isn't the kind to let things go once they've invested so much time and effort into someone. Sarah took the folder, her hands shaking, and opened it slowly. She scanned the pages, her eyes falling on a photograph of herself, one she recognized from her childhood, standing with her mother at the park. A handwritten note at the bottom of the photo read, Sarah Reeves, daughter of Eleanor Reeves. Potential key to the success of Phoenix Initiative. Her heart stopped as she turned the page, revealing a series of classified documents, detailing connections to various international political players and agencies. At the center of it all were the names of people she didn't know. Some she recognized from the news, politicians and businessmen with power and influence. This isn't real, Sarah muttered, shaking her head in disbelief. This is all a lie. How could I be part of something like this? Michael sat back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. This is very real, Sarah, and your mother did everything she could to protect you from it. But the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to stay out of it. Your involvement was never a choice. It was part of who you are. This organization, the people behind it, they've been watching you. And your mother's actions. Well, they put you on their radar. Sarah's mind was racing, trying to piece together everything she had just learned. She had always felt like an outsider in her own life, but this was something else. She wasn't just ordinary. She was a pawn in a high-stakes game she didn't even know existed. But why now? Why are they after me? She asked, her voice cracking. Why didn't my mom just tell me this? Why keep me in the dark for so long? Michael's expression softened, but only slightly, because she wanted you to have a normal life, a life away from all of this. She wanted you to live as far from this world as possible. But there's only so much you can control, Sarah. The moment they saw your potential, they started making their moves. There was a pause, and for a moment, Sarah just sat there, staring at the papers in front of her, her mind spinning. She couldn't process all of this. She didn't know how to accept it. The truth was too much to handle. The life she had built, the person she had thought she was gone. Michael leaned forward slightly. Listen, Sarah. I'm not telling you this to scare you. I'm telling you this because you need to understand the stakes. The organization that's been tracking you, that's been tracking your mother, is not going to stop. They will come for you. They'll come for anyone who gets in their way. And the longer you wait, the harder it will be to escape them. I don't have a choice, do I? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael's face was grim. Not anymore. The night was growing late, and the library had grown even quieter, the only sound now being the faint hum of the lights overhead. Sarah sat motionless in the chair, her mind filled with questions that had no answers. She was out of time. The pieces were falling into place, but the puzzle was too complex to solve in one sitting. She looked at Michael, who seemed to sense the turmoil inside her. I'll help you, he said, breaking the silence. I'll help you figure out what's going on. But we have to move quickly. They're already looking for you. But why me? What makes me so special? What could I possibly have that they want? Sarah's voice cracked with frustration. She had been asking herself that same question all night, and it didn't make sense. Nothing made sense. Michael paused for a moment, then spoke, his voice quieter now, almost apologetic. Because of what your mother knew and because of what you could know. The organization believes that you're the key to unlocking something bigger. You may not believe it now, but you have knowledge. Knowledge that could change everything. Knowledge about what? Sarah asked, her heart racing. What could I possibly know that could change the world? Michael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up, crossing the room to a nearby shelf, and pulled out a small box. He opened it slowly, revealing a collection of old keys and maps. Maps that looked eerily familiar. like something out of an old treasure hunt. He pulled one out and handed it to Sarah. "This is the key to a place your mother once worked with," he said, his voice low and serious. "A place that holds the answers you're looking for. A place that could unlock everything. About your mother, about Operation Phoenix, and about you." Sarah stared at the key in her hand. It was small, intricately designed, and unlike anything she had ever seen before. It didn't make sense. But somehow, she knew. This asterisk was what she had been missing. The answer. The key to everything. Chapter 6. The Secret Door. The key was heavier than Sarah had expected. As she turned it over in her hand, she felt an unsettling sense of finality, like this small, ornate object could unravel everything she thought she knew about herself and her past. It seemed absurd. She had been an ordinary woman, a daughter grieving the loss of a mother who had kept her distance from anything mysterious or dangerous. Yet, now she was holding the key to something that might change the course of her life forever. "Where do I use this?" she asked Michael, her voice shaking. She didn't want to ask, didn't want to be dragged deeper into this world of shadows and secrets, but she knew she had no choice. This was bigger than her. It always had been. Michael watched her closely, his gaze calculating. "I don't have all the answers yet, but I know someone who does." Sarah felt a wave of unease. She had trusted Michael, trusted him when he had explained the dark truth about her mother's past, about the operation, about the people who were now hunting her. But someone else? It felt like the next step, like she was being pushed further into a labyrinth with no map. "Who?" she asked, reluctant to know, yet knowing she had no choice but to follow this thread wherever it led. Michael hesitated for a moment before speaking. "A former associate of your mother's. Someone who was part of the team involved in the initial stages of Operation Phoenix. His name is David Caldwell. He's an old contact of mine. If anyone knows about the place your mother was trying to protect you from, it's him." Sarah didn't know how to feel about this. David Caldwell, a name that meant nothing to her. But Michael's demeanor was serious, and his eyes told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't something they could delay. Her life had already been altered by forces beyond her control, and the clock was ticking. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice steely with resolve. "He's not easy to reach," Michael replied, "but I have a few ways. We'll have to leave New York for this. I've arranged everything. We're going to meet him in a small town in Pennsylvania. He's been living under the radar for years, ever since the operation dissolved. But I know he's still active, still connected." "Pennsylvania?" Sarah repeated. "Why there?" Michael looked at her, the weight of his words pressing down on them both. "Your mother wanted you safe, Sarah. But there's a place she kept secret from even me, and Caldwell is the only one who can show you where it is. The key you're holding is for that place." Everything inside Sarah screamed to run. Run from Michael, from this key, from the world she was being dragged into. But the weight of her mother's hidden life, of the mysterious forces that had been manipulating her from the shadows, kept her glued to the chair. She couldn't walk away. She wouldn't. "All right," Sarah said, the word feeling strange on her tongue. "We'll go." It was late when Sarah and Michael drove through the streets of New York, their car packed and ready for the journey. The city felt distant now, the towering skyscrapers shrinking in the rearview mirror, as if they were a world she was leaving behind. The drive was long, quiet at first, each passing mile a reminder that Sarah was headed into a world that was beyond anything she could have imagined. She had no idea what to expect when they arrived in Pennsylvania, no idea what David Caldwell might be like, or how much of the truth he was willing to reveal. As they neared the outskirts of the small town, the landscape around them shifted. The bustling noise of the city faded, replaced by the stillness of the rural countryside. Rolling hills and empty roads stretched out before them, the moon casting an eerie light over the land. It was as though the very landscape was holding its breath, waiting for them to arrive. "Are we close?" Sarah asked, breaking the silence that had settled over them. "Almost," Michael replied, his eyes scanning the road ahead. "Caldwell's been hiding out in a cabin near the woods for years. No one knows where he is except for a few trusted people. It's been a long time since I've seen him, But if anyone can help us now, it's him. They drove further, the silence of the night pressing in on Sarah's mind. She couldn't help but think about what lay ahead. What if David Caldwell didn't want to help? What if he had his own agenda? What if he was as dangerous as the organization hunting her? Every step felt like a risk, and yet, Sarah had no other choice but to trust Michael. Finally, they turned off the main road, following a narrow, winding path that led deeper into the woods. The trees seemed to close in around them as they drove, casting dark shadows across the road. The cabin came into view, nestled between the trees, an isolated, almost abandoned-looking structure. Michael pulled the car to a stop, the engine cutting off with a soft hum. They both sat in the silence for a moment, the weight of the decision ahead of them pressing down on Sarah's chest. "This is it," Michael said softly. "We go in, find Caldwell, and get the answers we need. No turning back." Sarah nodded, her pulse racing. There was no turning back now, and she knew it. They got out of the car, and as they approached the cabin, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. The air seemed heavier here, as though the woods themselves held secrets. Secrets that had been buried for years. Michael knocked on the door 3 times, a series of sharp, measured raps. They waited in tense silence, the only sounds the rustling of the leaves in the wind. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, and a man appeared in the doorway. He was older than Sarah had expected, late 50s, with graying hair and a rough, weathered face that spoke of years spent hiding from something. His eyes were sharp, calculating, but there was a certain weariness to them, as though he had long ago accepted that the world was filled with things that couldn't be undone. "Michael," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "It's been a long time." "David," Michael replied, his tone guarded but respectful. "We need your help. It's about Sarah." David's gaze shifted to Sarah, and for a moment, she felt exposed, like he was seeing straight through her, straight to her soul. It was an uncomfortable feeling, but she stood her ground. "Come inside," David said, stepping back to allow them in. The cabin was small, sparsely furnished, with dim lighting and the scent of wood smoke hanging in the air. Sarah glanced around, taking in the cramped space. There were old maps pinned to the walls, along with newspapers and books scattered across the tables. David motioned for them to sit, and they did. Michael sat across from Sarah, his gaze flickering between her and David. She could tell he was waiting for David to speak first. David sat down heavily in the chair across from them, his eyes narrowing as he studied Sarah. "Your mother wasn't just trying to protect you from the world, you know. She was trying to keep you away from something far bigger than either of us. The key you're holding is not just for a place. It's for a person. A place where the truth lies about your family, about Operation Phoenix, and about why you're being hunted." Sarah's heart raced as she listened, a cold sweat breaking out on her skin. This wasn't just about her mother anymore. It was about Sarah's own survival. And it seemed like every step she took only led her deeper into a maze she couldn't escape. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice quiet but firm. David leaned forward, his eyes darkening. "Everything, huh? All right, Sarah. Let's start with where your mother's story really ends. And where yours begins. Chapter 7. The Echoes of the Past." The air inside the cabin was thick with tension, and Sarah could feel it pressing down on her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. Caldwell's dark eyes were locked on her as he sat back in his chair, his hands folded in front of him, steady and calculating. The silence stretched out, thick with anticipation, as though they were waiting for something or someone to speak. Sarah swallowed hard, trying to steady her racing heart. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. At least, she thought it was. Every step of this journey had brought her closer to the truth, but with every answer came more questions. She had already learned so much about her mother's past, about the shadowy world she had been part of, but now, with Caldwell sitting across from her, she felt like she was on the edge of something much larger, something more dangerous than anything she had ever imagined. "All right," Sarah said, breaking the silence. Her voice was a little shakier than she intended, but she forced herself to keep it steady. "You said you were going to tell me everything. I'm listening," Caldwell studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. Your mother didn't just protect you from the world, Sarah. She was trying to protect you from the truth. She didn't want you involved in what she had been part of, what she had helped create. But the truth, it always catches up to you. And when it does, there's no running from it. Sarah leaned forward, trying to mask the gnawing fear in her gut. Tell me what she was involved in. What is Operation Phoenix really? Caldwell's gaze shifted, and for a brief moment, Sarah saw something flicker in his eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or regret. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the cold, hard reality of the situation. Operation Phoenix was never just about espionage or covert operations. He began slowly, his voice quiet, as though he were choosing his words carefully. It was about power, control over information, over people. The people behind it, they didn't just want to influence world events, they wanted to shape them, to make them. Your mother was one of the original architects of the program. She was a part of a small, elite group that believed the world needed to be restructured. And not just the political landscape, everything. The way people think, the way they live. Sarah's head spun. Her mother, a woman she had always seen as just a regular, loving mother, had been part of something so vast, so dangerous. It was hard to reconcile the two images. The mother who had raised her and the woman Caldwell was describing. She had thought of her mother as a protector, someone who kept the shadows at bay. But now, it seemed, her mother had been just as much a part of those shadows as anyone else. So she helped create this? Sarah gestured to the cabin, to the secrecy, to the world Caldwell was now describing. She helped create a program that controlled people? And I'm supposed to just accept that? Caldwell's eyes softened a fraction. It wasn't that simple, Sarah. Nothing about this has ever been simple. Your mother wasn't just in it for the power. She believed she was helping people, believed that the world needed someone to steer it in the right direction. But then, things changed. She saw how deep the organization's reach went, how corrupt it had become. She tried to get out, to pull you away from it. But the people in charge, the ones at the top of the program, they don't let go of their assets so easily. Sarah was silent for a moment, trying to digest the flood of information Caldwell had just dumped on her. And now you want me to join the fight? To stop them? Caldwell shook his head, his face hardening again. It's not about joining a fight, Sarah. It's about surviving. There are people who are going to come after you. After your mother's legacy. After everything she left behind. The key you're holding. He pointed to the small, ornate object Sarah had tucked into her pocket. That's the key to everything. Your mother's final safeguard. But you need to understand something very important. They will stop at nothing to get it. The weight of his words settled over Sarah like a shroud. She had thought that finding the truth would bring her some kind of peace. But instead, it was only adding to the turmoil inside her. The past that she had so carefully kept at a distance, the memories of her mother, were now swirling into something much darker. Who are they? She asked, her voice quiet but firm. Caldwell's gaze hardened again, and he glanced at Michael before answering. The organization is still active, Sarah. Still pulling strings. They have agents everywhere. People you would never suspect. Politicians, businessmen, even people you trust. He looked at Michael as he said this, his meaning clear. Michael's expression remained stoic, but Sarah couldn't help but wonder if there was more to his past than he was letting on. And they're coming for you. Sarah felt a cold shiver run down her spine. It wasn't just a figure of speech, this was real. People were hunting her, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. What do I do? She asked, her voice breaking slightly. Caldwell stood up, pacing slowly around the room, as though weighing his words carefully. You need to go to the place your mother tried so hard to keep from you. The place where the answers lie. But getting there won't be easy. It's hidden. And it's guarded. Only a few people know how to access it. Your mother kept it safe, but the time has come for you to face it. Only then will you know what's really at stake. Where is it? Sarah asked, her mind already racing, trying to think of what her next step might be. There was no time to waste. She couldn't sit around waiting to be found. She needed to take control. Caldwell reached for a stack of maps on the table beside him, unfolding one and spreading it out in front of Sarah. He pointed to a remote location deep in the mountains of West Virginia, where the borders of 3 states converged. The place was isolated, surrounded by thick forests and rocky terrain. "This is where your mother hid it," he said, his voice low. "But getting there won't be easy. The organization has eyes everywhere, and they know you're close to the truth. You'll have to move fast. You can't trust anyone, Sarah. Not even me." For a moment, Sarah's heart sank. She had no choice. She couldn't let fear stop her now. She had come this far, and the truth was within reach. But the more she learned, the more she realized how little she really knew. The world her mother had lived in was darker, more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. "I'll go," she said finally, her voice steady. She looked at Michael, who had been silent throughout the exchange. His eyes locked on her. "But we need to move quickly. We leave now." Michael nodded, his expression unreadable. Caldwell didn't say anything but simply gestured to the door. "Then it's time to go. The road ahead won't be easy, Sarah. But if you want the answers, you have to face the danger. It's the only way." As they stepped outside into the cold night, Sarah felt a chill settle in her bones. They were no longer running from the truth. They were walking straight toward it. And she had no idea what she would find when they got there. But she knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 8: The Silent Pursuit. The journey to West Virginia was long, with the hours stretching out like endless waves of time. As the car rumbled down narrow country roads, the landscape outside the windows shifted from densely packed city streets to the untamed wilds of the Appalachian foothills. The air in the car felt heavy with tension, and every time Sarah looked out at the vast, empty roads ahead, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Michael sat in the driver's seat, his hands firm on the wheel, his eyes scanning the road with an intensity that Sarah hadn't seen before. His usual calm, almost detached demeanor had been replaced by something more primal, more alert. He wasn't just guarding her now, he was guarding them both. "So, how exactly are we supposed to find this place?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking the silence that had settled over them. The map that Caldwell had given her was folded neatly on her lap, the markings barely legible in the dim light of the car. "We'll follow the map," Michael said simply without looking at her. "And we'll trust that no one's watching us. That's all we can do right now." Sarah's fingers tightened around the map. It didn't make sense. There had to be more to this, more than just driving aimlessly to some unknown destination. She had never felt more vulnerable, not even in the moments when she first learned the truth about her mother's involvement in Operation Phoenix. Now, everything felt like it was closing in on her, suffocating her, and the map in her hands was the only thing that might lead her to some kind of clarity. "Michael, I need to know more," she said, her voice shaky. "About the people we're running from. About who's really after me." Michael didn't respond right away. His jaw tightened, and Sarah could see the muscles in his neck flex. The road ahead was long, and the weight of his silence was growing heavier with each passing minute. "They're called the Crows," Michael said finally, his voice low and gravelly. "A faction within the organization. They're relentless, and they've been hunting your mother for years. After she went underground, they made it their mission to find her. And now they've found you." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The name Crows sounded so innocuous, almost like a joke. But she knew better now than to underestimate anything. If they were part of the organization that her mother had tried to protect her from, they were capable of far more than she could imagine. "What do they want with me?" she asked, a chill creeping up her spine. "They want the key," Michael answered without hesitation. "That key is the only thing that can unlock the place your mother hid. It's the only thing that can lead to whatever she was trying to protect you from. And it's the only thing that they need to finish what she started. So, if I hand it over to them, they'll leave me alone?" Sarah scoffed bitterly. "I don't think so." Michael's eyes flicked to her for a split second before he focused back on the road. "No, they'll still come after you. But it's not about the key anymore, Sarah. They want control. They want power over whatever your mother was hiding. They want you to be part of their plan. And if you don't give them what they want, they'll do whatever it takes to get it. Sarah clenched her fists in her lap, the anger rising in her chest like a storm ready to break. How had it come to this? Her life had been shattered in the blink of an eye, torn apart by forces that she barely understood. The only thing she could trust now was herself, and the small key she carried in her pocket. "I'm not going to let them take it," she said firmly, more to herself than to Michael. "I'm not going to let them win." "Good," Michael said. His tone softened just a little, but there was a finality in his voice. "Because this road we're on, Sarah, it's the only one that'll lead you to the truth. The truth about your mother, about the people behind Operation Phoenix, and about who you really are." Hours later, they arrived at a small, nondescript cabin nestled deep in the woods, its outline barely visible against the dense canopy of trees. The cabin looked ancient, its windows darkened by grime and years of neglect. If it weren't for the faint glow coming from the window at the back, Sarah would have assumed it was abandoned. The sun had long set, and the chill of the evening air pressed against her skin as they stepped out of the car. The silence of the forest felt overwhelming, as if the trees themselves were watching their every move. Michael glanced at Sarah, his face unreadable. "This is it. We need to move quickly." They made their way toward the cabin, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of leaves on the ground. Sarah's heart beat in her throat as they approached the door. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, like the walls of the cabin were closing in. Michael knocked 3 times, quick, sharp raps, and they waited. The seconds stretched out painfully as Sarah's breath fogged in the cool night air. Then the door creaked open. A tall, thin man stood in the doorway, his face obscured by shadows. He wore a dark coat and a hood, and his posture was rigid, almost mechanical. There was something unsettling about him, something off. But there was no time to waste and no time for second-guessing. "I'm here to see him," Michael said, his voice quiet but firm. The man nodded once, then stepped aside to allow them entry. Without a word, they stepped into the cabin, and Sarah immediately felt the weight of the room settle over her. The air inside was thick and musty, a mixture of stale cigarette smoke and something older, more acrid. The cabin was sparsely furnished, with a few old chairs around a wooden table and shelves filled with boxes and papers stacked haphazardly. In the far corner, a man sat hunched over a computer, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the screen. He was older than Michael, with salt and pepper hair and a hard expression that didn't soften when he saw them. "Sit down," the man said without looking up. His voice was gravelly, as though it hadn't been used in years. Michael pulled out a chair and sat, his eyes never leaving the man. Sarah remained standing, her eyes darting around the room, taking in everything, watching for any sign of a threat. She wasn't sure who this man was or what role he played in this strange, dangerous world, but one thing was clear: he was part of it, and that made him both an ally and a potential enemy. "I don't have time for pleasantries," the man said finally, his gaze locking on Sarah. "I assume you're here for the same reason Michael brought you all the way out here. The key. And you're here to find out what your mother was hiding." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know who this man was, or how much he knew, but at this point, anyone who could help her find the truth was someone she needed to listen to. "Then let's get to it," the man said, finally turning off the computer screen and standing up. "I'll show you what you're looking for. But understand this, Sarah, what you find may be more than you're prepared for. Once you open that door, there's no going back. Are you ready?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and foreboding. Sarah took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "I'm ready," she said, the words feeling like a promise. The road to the truth had never been clearer or more dangerous. But there was no turning back now. Chapter 9. The Door to the Unknown. The room in the cabin was dimly lit by a single lamp hanging from the ceiling. Its soft, yellow glow barely illuminated the thick shadows that seemed to cling to the corners, making everything feel more like a dream than reality. The man who had opened the door for them was still standing by the wall, watching them with a sharp, calculating gaze. His presence felt like a weight on Sarah's chest, a reminder that nothing about this journey would be easy. "Sit," the man said, nodding toward a worn sofa in the corner. "We'll talk about what you're about to see." Sarah glanced at Michael, who was already settling into a chair with a careful, composed expression. His eyes never left the man, his body tense, as though waiting for a signal. The weight of the unknown hung between them, thick and heavy. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being pushed into something far larger than she could understand. But at the same time, the desire for answers, for closure, for the truth about her mother, was overpowering. There was no turning back now. She lowered herself onto the couch, her fingers instinctively reaching into her pocket to touch the small, intricately carved key that had brought them here. It was still warm against her skin, as though it pulsed with the weight of the secret it guarded. The man by the wall spoke again, his voice low and cold, like a warning. "This key your mother left behind. It's not just a symbol of what she was trying to protect you from. It's a map, one that leads to a place that's been hidden for decades. Your mother, she was part of something much bigger than the Operation Phoenix you've heard about. This isn't just about secret programs or shadow governments. It's about control over something that could change the world." Sarah's stomach twisted at his words. The more she learned, the less she understood. Her mother had been hiding something, a powerful secret, a legacy she had tried to keep from her. But the closer Sarah got to the truth, the more she realized how little she really knew about the woman who had raised her. Her mother hadn't just kept secrets to protect her. She had kept secrets to protect the world. And now, Sarah was tangled in the very web her mother had worked so hard to untangle herself from. The man stepped forward, crossing the room to a large wooden cabinet against the far wall. He unlocked it with a key that hung on a chain around his neck, the metal clinking softly in the silence. He opened the cabinet slowly, as though showing them something precious or dangerous. Inside, nestled between layers of dust and age-worn paper, was a large, old-fashioned safe. Its surface was scratched and worn, but it was still formidable, like a relic from a time when secrets were meant to be kept forever. "This is where the truth lies," the man said, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Your mother didn't just hide the key. She hid everything. Everything she knew, everything she learned about what the crows were truly after. This is the last step, and it's the one thing they will kill for." Sarah stood up slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The safe was more than just a physical object. It was the final piece of a puzzle she had been desperately trying to solve. This was it. The answers she had been chasing for so long were within her reach. But the fear that had been building inside her gnawed at her, a reminder that the world she was about to enter was nothing like the one she had known. "How do we open it?" Sarah asked, her voice steady, though her hands shook at her sides. The man turned, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "With the key, of course. But it's not just a matter of turning the lock. It's more intricate than that. The mechanism inside the safe will only open if the key is used in the right way. And you," he looked at Sarah, his gaze piercing, "you're the only one who can do it." "Why me?" Sarah asked, feeling a growing unease in her stomach. She had spent years questioning her own place in this world, and now it seemed like she was being handed a role that she hadn't asked for. "You're your mother's daughter," the man said simply, his tone laced with a cold, unwavering certainty. "She prepared you for this moment. She just didn't know when it would come." A silence fell between them as Sarah absorbed his words. She wasn't sure if the man was lying or if he believed what he was saying. What she did know was that this was the point of no return. If she opened this safe, if she uncovered whatever secret it held, there was no going back to the life she had known. The normal life, the one that had been swept away the moment she learned about Operation Phoenix and her mother's past, would never exist again. The truth was waiting for her, but at what cost? Her fingers tightened around the key in her pocket. The edges of the carved wood digging into her skin. She had to do this. There was no other choice. Michael stood up, his eyes still locked on the man. "We're ready." The man nodded, his lips pressing together in a thin line. Without another word, he stepped back, motioning toward the safe. Sarah walked toward it slowly, each step measured, each breath heavier than the last. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. The safe towered in front of her, its cold steel surface gleaming in the dim light. The key in her hand seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as though it were calling her to use it. Sarah took a deep breath, her hand trembling as she inserted the key into the lock. The metal clicked into place, and she turned it, the sound echoing through the room like a warning. As the mechanism inside the safe began to move, she felt a shiver run down her spine. With a final twist, the safe's door creaked open. Inside, stacked neatly in layers of protective cloth, were files, thick old papers, each one sealed with a stamp Sarah didn't recognize. Some were yellowed with age, others pristine as though they had never been touched. But it wasn't the papers that caught Sarah's attention. It was the small, black box resting in the center, its edges worn, but still intact. The box was unlike anything she had seen before. Nothing about it was ordinary. The man stepped forward and picked up the box, his hands careful as though it might break under the slightest pressure. He turned it over, revealing a small, intricate symbol on the bottom. "This," he said quietly, his voice barely a whisper, "is what they've been looking for. This is what they'll stop at nothing to control." Sarah's pulse quickened as the box was placed in her hands. She could feel the weight of it, both physically and metaphorically. This was the key to everything, the secret her mother had spent her life hiding. The moment had come, and there was no turning back. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. The man's eyes darkened. "It's not just a thing, Sarah. It's a message, a weapon, a way to control the future." The air in the room thickened with tension, and Sarah could feel her world shifting beneath her feet. The truth was finally within reach, but the cost of uncovering it was more than she had ever imagined. The man looked at her, his expression grim. "Are you sure you're ready for what's inside?" Chapter 10, The Final Choice. The room seemed to close in on Sarah as she held the box, her fingers trembling around its smooth, cold surface. The moment was fragile, delicate, like a fragile thread stretching across an abyss. She could feel the weight of the man's words sinking into her skin, the pressure of his gaze like an invisible hand gripping her heart. She wasn't just holding a box. She was holding a future that could change everything. "Open it," the man said, his voice a quiet command. He was no longer just an ally, no longer someone who simply wanted to help. Now he was a harbinger of something darker. He knew the consequences of what was in that box, and he knew the consequences of what would happen if it fell into the wrong hands. Sarah looked down at the box. It was simple in design, unadorned, but there was something about it that screamed importance. This box was the key to everything, the key to her mother's past, to the lies that had been buried for years, to the organization that had been chasing her and her mother relentlessly. The crows, the people who wanted control, who would do anything to use her and her family's secrets for their own ends. A sudden flash of memory hit Sarah like a wave. Her mother, standing by the window, her back turned, whispering urgently that she should never trust anyone, that she had to run, that the truth would destroy them both. Sarah had always thought those words were just another paranoid warning. But now, in this room, they felt like the deepest truth she had ever known. She glanced at Michael, who stood silently across the room, his face unreadable, his eyes shadowed by uncertainty. Michael had always been her protector, the one constant she could rely on in a world that had turned upside down. But she could see the tension in his body, the way his hands were balled into fists at his sides. She could sense the fear that they were running out of time. "Michael," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking slightly, "what if we're not meant to open it? What if this is a mistake?" Michael's eyes flickered briefly toward her, and in that moment, she could see the struggle in his face. He was conflicted. He wanted to reassure her, but he knew as well as she did that there was no turning back now. There was no undoing this. The decision was hers to make. "You know what's at stake," he said quietly. "This is bigger than both of us. This could change everything. But only if you're ready to face it." The weight of his words settled over Sarah like a blanket of cold air. This wasn't just about her anymore. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth or protecting herself from the crows. This was about something much more dangerous, a power that could shift the balance of the world. A weapon in the wrong hands could destroy everything. The man by the wall, still watching her with those cold, emotionless eyes, took a step forward. There's no time for second-guessing. If you wait too long, they'll find us. They'll find you, and when they do, nothing will stop them from getting what they want. You can't keep running forever, Sarah. Her fingers curled tighter around the box. The key was still inside, but it wasn't just the lock she was afraid of now. It was the choice to open it and step into a world she didn't understand. The choice to destroy or protect the legacy her mother had left behind. Is there any other way? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Any other way to stop them? The man shook his head, his expression cold and final. Once they know you have it, there's no escaping. They'll stop at nothing. There's only one way out of this. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. Her mother had always warned her that there were no easy answers in this world, that the price of the truth was always higher than you could imagine. Sarah had spent her life searching for answers, for a way to understand her mother's hidden life. But now, the answer was sitting in front of her, wrapped in this small, mysterious box. She didn't know what was inside, but she knew that whatever it was, it had the power to change everything. And that frightened her more than anything else. She took a deep breath and turned the box over in her hands, feeling the cool metal of the latch beneath her fingers. It was now or never. There was no way back. Whatever happened next, she would have to live with it. The truth was about to come crashing down. Her hands shook as she released the latch. The sound was quiet, so quiet it almost felt like the universe itself was holding its breath. The box opened. Inside, there was nothing extraordinary. No glowing artifact, no strange weapon of power. Instead, it was a simple piece of paper, folded neatly and sealed with an old, waxen emblem that she didn't recognize. Her pulse quickened as she carefully pried it open, revealing the contents. The paper was old, the edges curling with age, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was her mother's. The words, written in a hurried, almost panicked scrawl, seemed to dance before her eyes. Asterisk, the key is not to the past, Sarah. It is to the future. The choice you make will determine who controls it. The crows will stop at nothing to possess it, but they do not understand its true power. Do not trust anyone. The world will change because of you. You must decide whether to keep it hidden or destroy it completely. There is no middle ground, no safe option. Only the consequences of your actions. If you choose wrong, the world will burn. Asterisk. Sarah felt a chill wash over her, the weight of her mother's words sinking deep into her soul. The key wasn't just about uncovering the past, it was about the future. The power to reshape the world lay in her hands. And now, Sarah was standing at a crossroads, at the point of no return. The door to the unknown had opened, but what lay beyond it was still unclear. The decision was hers. She slowly looked up at the man, her heart racing. What happens now? He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. Now, Sarah, you make the choice. You can either keep it hidden, destroy it, and live in the shadows for the rest of your life. Or you can use it to change the world and risk everything in the process. The weight of the choice pressed down on her. Sarah had been living in the shadows of her mother's past for so long. But now, for the first time, the future was within her reach. A future that could be molded by her hands. There was no easy answer, no simple way to protect the world from the chaos that lay ahead. But in that moment, Sarah knew one thing for sure. Her mother had left her this choice for a reason. It was her destiny to decide. The world would either burn or it would be rebuilt. And Sarah was the one who would decide which it would be.